Let's continue our exploration of the Zen tradition and of the Zen account of what a truly meaningful life looks like. In our last lecture, we introduced many of the fundamental ideas in Zen, and especially the emphasis that Zen places on understanding our own mind, the nature of our own experience, and understanding the world through this focus on impermanence and momentariness, and the emphasis on the notion of a kind of primordial awakening that requires recovery. Today, we're going to go deeper into the Zen analysis. Things will get a bit more abstract, but I'm hoping that by the end we'll make complete sense of this idea of our own Buddha nature and primordial awakening as the foundation for the meaning of our lives. We're going to talk first about the complex idea of dualism and non-dualism, duality and non-duality in Zen. Many people who are familiar even a little bit with Zen rhetoric and Zen literature understand this idea of non-duality or of subject-object unity. So we'll talk about that a bit. We'll talk further about the complex relationship between perception and conception, and the need to focus on perception as a mode for taking up with the world to reduce conception, an idea that of course comes in from Taoism. Then we're going to come back into Dogen himself and really focus on the idea that Dogen develops of being time, in Japanese uji, this word being time, one word, and of primordial presence in the world. That will lead us to a discussion of the concept of Buddha nature, to understand our notion of primordial awakening, and then we'll be able to conclude with the Zen account of mindfulness and what it is to find the meaning of life by living in each moment fully present. That's the plan for today. So let's begin by talking about this idea of duality and non-duality. And this is going to take us back to India, and we're going to be moving back to the Indian roots of Zen. The Zen tradition regards the great 2nd, 3rd century Indian philosopher Nagarjuna. That's the guy who went down to the Nagas, the sea serpents, to recover the Prajnaparamita Sutras, if you remember our discussion of the rise of Mahayana. This guy, Nagarjuna, the snake guy, they all see him as an important patriarch for Zen, and they all pay a great deal of attention to Nagarjuna's philosophical work. And the particular philosophical work of Nagarjuna that will be important for this tradition is the one called Mula Madhyamaka Karika, which means fundamental verses on the middle way. And the reason that's important is because it is in that text, specifically in the 24th chapter, that Nagarjuna really distinguishes what he calls the two truths, or two realities, and explains that even though they're distinct in one sense, they constitute a fundamental unity. So when Nagarjuna does this, he distinguishes conventional or everyday mundane truth from ultimate truth. Conventional mundane truth is the way the world appears to our ordinary consciousness. The fact that grass is green and snow is white, that we are interdependent, that water is made out of H2O, all of this is part of everyday mundane conventional truth. And it's very important to grasp mundane truth, because if you don't, you get into big trouble. But this mundane truth, or conventional truth, Nagarjuna thought, is not the ultimate story about things. The ultimate story about things is that mundane phenomena are empty of essence, empty of independence, empty of permanence. They are in fact impermanent, interdependent, essenceless phenomena, and that our ordinary mode of taking up with the world, as we've said, and we've talked about the danger of that, is to superimpose permanence, essence, independence on these things which themselves are empty of all of that. So we can see the two truths as distinct in that one of them posits entities with which we naively take up as permanent, independent phenomena, including ourselves, by the way, including our own minds. The other one says these things are empty of being the way that we actually normally take them to be. But when we see them that way, we also see that there's a deep unity between the two truths, because one way to characterize the ultimate truth of emptiness is that conventional phenomena are just conventional. They're no more than that. Their identities are posited by us conventionally through names, through language, through conceptuality, and they're posited on things that do not inherently have those identities. So the two truths are distinct in our awareness, but are ontologically unified, are unified in being. Now, this gives rise to the idea that not only are phenomena empty, but their emptiness, that is the fact that they're empty, is also itself empty. Because for a thing, like a table or like my hand, to be empty is for it to have this property of emptiness, but it's the emptiness of my hand depends upon my hand. If I don't have a hand, I don't have any emptiness of my hand. And for that reason, this notion of emptiness itself is not understood in Madhyamaka Buddhism, in this middle way Buddhism, to be a deeper reality behind ordinary things, but to be just the reality of ordinary things. And so itself to be empty of essence, empty of independence, empty of permanence. And for that reason, we don't say that ordinary things are empty, there's just emptiness. We say that even emptiness is empty, it's emptiness all the way down. You'll recall that when we talked about the Mahayana, we said that there was this new sutra foundation for the Mahayana that constituted in these sutras that might have been left with the sea serpents or might have been written about 500 years after the Buddha's death being discovered. And the word sutra, let's remember, refers to a discourse that is attributed to the Buddha, either as the Buddha's own speech or as something said in the presence of the Buddha that the Buddha approved. One of the really important sutras for the foundation of Zen is the so-called Heart Sutra, or Heart of Wisdom Sutra. A sutra which, by the way, contemporary scholars now believe may well have been, or probably was, composed in China and then sent back to India, retranslated into Sanskrit, and now has this kind of faux Indian ancestry. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the beginning of the Heart Sutra to understand this idea of emptiness, of the emptiness of emptiness, and of the non-duality of the ultimate and the conventional truth. The story of the Heart Sutra, it's a very short sutra, and it's a text that almost every Buddhist in any Buddhist country memorizes in the way that Christians memorize the Lord's Prayer and Jews memorize the Shema. It's a very short text, about a page long. But it begins roughly like this. The Buddha is hanging out on this small mountain near Rajgir that you can visit today called Vulture Peak. And he's up there with a big assembly of monks and bodhisattvas and deities and all kinds of celestial beings. And with him are a number of his close disciples. And one of them, and the Buddha is up there in meditation, and he's meditating on this kind of contemplation that's called the enumeration of phenomena. That is a contemplation of the manifold nature of reality, the complexity of reality, and how things are interdependent. And while he's doing that, his chief disciple in the Pali tradition, Shariputra, who is regarded in Shravakayana, the disciples' Buddhism, as the foremost of the wise, the wisest of all of the disciples, asks this bodhisattva who's hanging out there, Avalokiteshvara, who is the embodiment of compassion in the Mahayana tradition. So Shariputra asks Avalokiteshvara, hey, how does a person who's in a noble lineage, somebody who wants to be noble, practice the profound perfection of wisdom? That is, how does one become truly wise? And the answer to that question is really interesting. There's one nice little footnote on this. Avalokiteshvara answers him. It actually goes like this. Shariputra says, how does a son of noble lineage practice the perfection of wisdom? And Avalokiteshvara replies, a son or daughter of noble lineage who wants to practice the perfection of wisdom. One of the earliest feminist moments in Buddhism. I kind of love that. But anyway, here's what he says. He says that somebody who wants to really understand the nature of reality should contemplate the components of reality, the aggregates as they're called, or the heaps, the piles, and should see that each of them is empty of essence. And then we get to this important line, often called the fourfold profundity. He says, form is empty, but emptiness is form. Form isn't different from emptiness. Emptiness isn't different from form. Now, what does that mean? It's very obscure, and there's many different commentaries that try to explain this. But the point's actually pretty simple. The point is just that form, that is physical reality, that's what the word form means, physical reality. Physical reality is empty of essence, empty of permanence, empty of independence. But emptiness is form. That is, to be empty is just to be the emptiness of ordinary things. It's not a deeper reality behind that. When we say emptiness and form aren't different from one another, we mean that if you really understand what it is to be an ordinary conventional phenomenon, if you really understand it, you understand that it's empty, impermanent, interdependent. And if you really understand emptiness, you just understand the ordinary world around us, which is nothing but empty phenomena. And so, in this sense, these two truths, these two realities, even though they involve two different kinds of apprehension of the world, one in terms of just ordinary stuff, and the other in terms of its deep nature, are actually non-dually related. They're the same thing. And if you really apprehend things fully, conventionally, you apprehend their ultimate nature. If you really apprehend emptiness, this notion of voidness, of essence, then all you apprehend is the ordinary nature of ordinary things. So in this sense, for Zen, phenomenology, the nature of our own experience, joins with metaphysics. When metaphysically, we understand that there's no difference between ordinary reality and its ultimate nature. But phenomenologically, that is in terms of our own experience, we understand that to really experience ordinary reality the way it is to understand, to experience it as it is ultimately, impermanent, constantly changing, without essence. And to experience that is just to see things as they are, not to see behind them, not to see beyond them, not to see a reality that's hidden from ordinary consciousness, but to see the reality that is there in front of ordinary consciousness all the time. And that is to see the reality of who we are as we in fact are, to understand ourselves as we experience ourselves and not as we project an experience of ourselves. Now, all of this ties deeply to the distinction so important to the Zen tradition between perception and conception. From a Zen perspective, when we distinguish between perception and conception, we're distinguishing between two modes of awareness. One by our six senses. Remember, in a Buddhist tradition, we have our five ordinary senses, and then the introspective sense by which we examine our own minds and our own consciousness. When you look inside and see how you're feeling, you're using that sixth sense. It's not ESP. And then inference, when we go beyond what's sensorily available to us and to draw conclusions from it. Now, from a Buddhist point of view, these two kinds of awareness have two different objects. The awareness of our senses are particular things. When I see an apple, I see a particular apple. When I see a tree, I see a particular tree. I don't see applehood in general. When I see red, I see a particular patch of red, not redness. But conception, inference, takes as its object universals, abstract qualities. So when I think about apples, I'm not thinking necessarily about a particular apple. I'm thinking about apples in general. When I think about red, I'm thinking about the color, not a particular patch. Now, the importance of this is that if you think about universals, that is, these abstract concepts, they've got an important property. They're permanent, that is, you don't say red could go out of existence sometime, and they're independent of their particular instantiations. Even if I went around the world with a white paintbrush and painted everything that was red white, I wouldn't eliminate redness. I would just eliminate all of the instances of redness. Redness would still be there, waiting for the next strawberry to ripen. Because they're independent and because they're permanent, Buddhists argue, and to go through these arguments would take us far afield, but take my word for it, that they're actually unreal. That universals are the wrong kinds of things to be real, because to be real is to be impermanent, interdependent, and so forth. And so, for this reason, Buddhists of all stripes think that even though perception, including introspection, can reveal reality to us, conception, because it always involves engagement with abstract concepts, and those abstract concepts have unreal objects, is always deceptive. For this reason, when we think about ourselves or other things as permanent, that is, as having identity over time, when I imagine that I am the same person who delivered the first lecture on Zen, or who will deliver the next lecture, or who is even delivering this lecture at the very beginning when I greeted you, that I am imputing to myself an identity over time that results from my employing a concept, the concept of moments of J. Garfield's existence, and engaging with that concept instead of engaging with each moment of my existence. But that concept isn't real. It's purely deceptive. And so our experience of permanence, like our experience of independence, results from this superimposition of conception over perception. By superimposing conception over perception, we fail to see actual momentary phenomena. We see these illusory permanent phenomena, these illusory independent phenomena, and we've superimposed them over what's real. It's as though we put a film between ourselves and reality, and all we see is the weird film. And of course, in doing that, we fail to see the ultimate nature of reality. We fail to see the interdependence and the impermanence of things, including the interdependence and the impermanence of ourselves and our own state and our own experience. That is, we fail to see that our being in the world is like the moon in the dewdrop falling from the waterfowl's beak. And instead we think, hey, we're here for a while, things are cool, we don't need to worry about anything at all, and death isn't really going to happen, it happens to other people. If we can strip away that superimposition, then and only then and only then do we get to see conventional reality as it is, actual, interdependent, impermanent, constantly changing phenomena. And therefore, by seeing them as impermanent, as interdependent, as constantly changing, as essenceless, to see the ultimate nature of reality. And when we do that, we see the absence of the duality between the conventional and the ultimate that texts like the Heart Sutra or like Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika are teaching. But also in doing that, another duality disappears. And this is a profound and important duality. The duality that disappears and the duality that so often structures ordinary, diluted, meaningless life is subject-object duality. Why is it so important, and why does it disappear? Well, it's important for precisely the following reason. In ordinary experience, we distinguish ourselves as the subjects and everything else around us as objects, including you, including the people we know and love, all just kind of sit there as objects. And they sit there as distinct from and independent of us. And that allows us to experience reality in what I call the polar coordinate way, where I am at the center of the universe and everything else is experienced in relation to me. My tree, my mother, my child, my dog, my friend, my enemy, my students, people who aren't my students, and so forth. And so I think that the nature of things is given by their relationship to me as subject. And therefore, I become the most important thing in the world, since everything literally revolves around me. Thinking about that for even a moment, we see it's a pretty stupid idea. It's a stupid idea, but from a Zen perspective, it's the idea that underlies all of our ordinary engagement. Once we drop the notion that we exist as substantial phenomena and that we are interdependent, constantly changing processes engaged with everything else, then that pole of subject and object disappears, because there no longer is the permanent subject experienced to be the subject of its objects. Therefore, by obtaining this kind of non-dual awareness, we are finally able to engage with reality as it is, not reality as we conceptually project it. That's what allows us to have an openness to others, to take others seriously, not just as our objects or things related to us, but as non-different from us, others, and to see ourselves as just a continuum of processes engaged with them. And it allows us to also be open to experience our own experience and not to repackage it through conceptual thought and words. And as Taoists would have emphasized, and as Zen practitioners also emphasize, that is what enables our spontaneity. That's what enables us to just act instead of calculate and deliberate, and instead of to calculate and deliberate. And so that allows us to be truly effective. And finally, in this whole package, we can see that by doing that, it decreases the attachment and the aversion that are those secondary roots of suffering that emerge from the primal confusion of seeing ourselves at the center pole, as the center of the universe. When you've got that, you become attached to things as yours, and you become attached to yourself. You can drop that attachment, drop that aversion, and so drop the suffering by dropping the non-dual awareness. Dropping that non-dual awareness allows us to enter into a kind of experience, this kind of experience that Dogen thinks is central to the meaningful life, what we're really after, which Dogen calls being time, or presence, real presence in the world. The term again in Japanese is uji, which just is a compound of being and time. And he develops this in his wonderful and very large and very obscure, I promise you, text called Shobogenzo. If you get really interested in Dogen, this is the text you'll read. But I warn you, it's a text that requires a great deal of patience. It's complex, obscure, but it rewards close reading. We're not going to be reading the text closely, but we are going to be talking about the ideas. So Dogen emphasizes that existence itself is temporal. It's saturated with time. As Dogen would put it, time is the nature of our world, not a kind of abstract container in which the world occurs. So if you think, for instance, about Isaac Newton and the Newtonian view about space and time that so characterize a lot of our ordinary modern conception and reflects our kind of ordinary consciousness. We think of time as this big container that's got the past in it, it's got the future in it, it's got the present, and we kind of move through time. Dogen points out that that actually doesn't make any sense. It's not that there's time and then stuff happening in time. Time is change, and so it's constituted by things that are changing. Things don't happen in time. Time happens. Time exists because things happen. And Dogen emphasizes that time, thought about this way, which is so central to our being, and which we so rarely really allow ourselves to experience, has two fundamental aspects. And these aspects are what really are at the heart of understanding the nature of our lives and why our lives are worth living. First aspect for Dogen is that time is experienced as moving. We experience it as a succession. One event follows another, one generation follows another, one season follows another. We think of time as kind of flowing from the past to the future, past the present, and we experience it in this mode of change. And in that sense, we think of time as something that's just this kind of current. And we saw that vision of time in the words of Marcus Aurelius as well as in the words of Lucretius. But Dogen points out that there's a second aspect of time beyond time as motion and change. And he refers to this as time arrayed or ranging. And the simile he uses is it's like a mountain range. When you survey a mountain range, the mountains over there and the mountains over there both exist at the same time. If we pan our eyes from left to right, we see the mountains in succession, but the mountains are arrayed simultaneously with one another. Just so, says Dogen, when we imagine the past, the present, and the future, they're set out arrayed like a mountain range. We may only right now be experiencing the present, but the present only exists and only is significant in its relationship to the past and its relationship to the future. Like a mountain range, no matter how good a climber you are, you can only be on one peak at a time. And in that sense, an individual living in time can only be living at one moment and not in multiple moments simultaneously. So when we talk about time being arrayed, we don't mean that we are living in the past, present, and future simultaneously. We're only on one peak in that array. But that peak gets its location, gets its significance because it is after a past, before a future, causally connected to those. And that we won't stay on that peak. We'll move to the next peak, the next peak, the next peak. So for Dogen, given that the real nature of reality and of our own experience is time, and given that time has these two dimensions, flowing and ranged out, To live in actual presence, to actually live in the moment of time in which I am now talking and you are now listening, is to live precisely in a single moment, which vanishes just as quickly as it arises. It's that impermanent. However, that moment is a moment which is only a moment in the context of a past and a future that give it meaning. So the moment that you are experiencing right now has its significance, has its meaning, and has its own reality only because of everything that came before it, including, for instance, all of this lecture that's come before this present moment now, and only is important because it precedes what comes after it, including all of the things perhaps that I'm going to say after this, and whatever you're going to do after you stop listening or stop watching this lecture. To ignore the moment that we live in is to lose reality, because all that's real is that moment in which we exist. But to ignore the past and the future is to lose the very meaning of that reality. And so for Dogen, the point about temporality is that our reality, where we live, is right here, right now, at this moment. But to only pay attention to the moment in which we live is to lose its significance. Not to live in the moment is to lose reality completely. To live only in that moment without awareness of its interconnection is to make our life completely meaningless. Now, the goal of all Zen practice, Zen study, Zen meditation, sitting, just like the goal of all Buddhist practice, is full awakening. Buddhism is called Buddhism because it's about Buddhahood. It's about leading an awakened life, as we saw Shantideva concerned to help us do. It's to lead a life that is lived in awareness of who we are, what we're doing, who's around us, and to be maximally effective, for our lives to be fully, fully meaningful. But that requires a complete understanding of existence, of our own existence and of the existence of all that's around us. To awaken is therefore not to suddenly see beyond reality. It's not to suddenly live somewhere else. It's not for everything around us to disappear. It's to see reality as it is. That's what's so important about the Zen insight, is there's nothing behind reality that's realer than it. There isn't something beyond us that gives our lives meaning, beyond our lives that gives our lives meaning, beyond the world that gives our lives meaning. What gives our lives meaning on this view is to fully understand, to fully engage with the world in which we find ourselves, because the ultimate reality of that world, as we saw a few moments ago, is identical with its conventional reality. Waking up is just to see reality as it is. And that is to drop conceptual superimposition, to drop all of this kind of thought and cultivation, to drop all of this linguistic and discursive engagement, just to perceive, to actually look, to actually listen, to actually introspect, and to perceive the impermanent, interdependent phenomena around us and in us, and that we are, as impermanent, interdependent phenomena, which eliminates the self-grasping that generates the selfishness, subject-object duality, and all of the suffering that falls in train. Dogen's deep insight is, we do that all the time. We are constantly perceiving, and what we're perceiving is always something impermanent, interdependent, and essenceless. We do that for a moment, and then we superimpose conception and labels and ideas and thoughts and mist it up almost as soon as we see it clearly. That phenomenological ground, that primordial perception, is the ground of our Buddha nature. That is what makes it possible for us to be awakened. Buddha nature is just the potentiality for living a fully awakened life. So we are, in this sense, primordially awakened, always in every moment, perceiving reality just as it is. Our task is to recover that state. Notice how Taoist that is, to recover our actual nature and to get rid of the conceptual accretions that hide us. That's why in this tradition, mindfulness is so important. You remember we emphasized mindfulness when we talked about Shantideva, that need to kind of guard practice. And Zen practice is all about mindfulness, the constant awareness of the nature of our own thought and our own being in every moment. The point is, it's necessary because that's what stops the conceptual superimposition. We can become aware of what we're perceiving. We can become aware of what we're feeling and of what's around us, and in that awareness, not be tempted to make the next move and to occlude it from ourselves. But this is hard. It's hard to live with that kind of constant momentary awareness. And that's why Zen recommends and requires such constant meditation and practice. It's a meditation and practice to become aware of reality just as it is. And according to Dogen, the result of that is the perception of the impermanence of the world, the beauty of the world, and the perfection of the world that we already live in, the perfection of the mundane world. And that can generate a kind of happiness and an understanding of the meaning of life without a quest for an illusory transcendence. Awareness, therefore, has always been available to us. It's always available. And a meaningful life, the happy life, from the Zen perspective, only requires a transformation of our mind. It only requires the recovery of the perfect mind with which we were born. The echoes of Taoism are tremendous here, but there's also this wonderful synthesis with these deep Buddhist ideas about impermanence and interdependence and the two truths that gives these ideas a deeper conceptual grounding and a more profound grip on our own phenomenology and awareness.